I want to talk to you about the Ending Improper Payments to Deceased People Act. Boy, that's a mouthful. Here's what I want to talk about. Many Louisianians read the stories about the welfare fraud in Minnesota and, frankly, in other states, and it makes them nauseous. I feel the same way. That's why I have been working for years, literally years, to target welfare fraud, especially the fraudsters who conduct fraud in the name of deceased Americans. In 2023 alone, for example, the federal government sent $1.3 billion, not million, billion. The federal government sent $1.3 billion to dead people. It's so pervasive that the Social Security Administration, which maintains a list of dead Americans known as the Death Master File, if someone dies, the state sends the name of the deceased person to the Social Security Administration, and that person's name is listed on what's called the Death Master File.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're taking a closer look at a statement from Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, where he outlines his effort to stop federal welfare payments from being sent to deceased individuals. According to Kennedy, the legislation has now passed both chambers of Congress and is headed to the president's desk. Rather than reacting emotionally or politically, my goal here is to analyze what Kennedy is saying, why this issue matters, how the policy actually works, and what it tells us about broader problems in federal governance and accountability. So let's break it down.
We found that Social Security was not sharing this information, the names of the folks on the Death Master File, with the rest of the federal government. One branch of government wasn't talking to another branch of government. The Social Security Administration told me when I confronted them about this and asked them, why don't you talk to your colleagues and other colleagues in the federal government so we can stop paying dead people? Social Security told me it needed Congress's permission to share this information with, for example, the Treasury Department, so it could include the list of dead Americans in its do not pay system. I didn't argue with them. I said, I'm just going to go pass a bill. Well, a few years ago I did. I passed a bill called the Stopping Improper Payments to Deceased People Act. And that bill allowed the Social Security Administration to temporarily share its Death Master File with the Department of the Treasury. I had to amend the bill to provide, it's a long story and it was frustrating, to provide for a temporary sharing. They wanted to try it out first. Well, it worked. Duh. Since December of 2023, this bill has saved the federal government at least $330 million in improper payments. We're no longer paying dead people and having their friends or relatives or whomever cash the checks. It was obvious that Congress needed to make this data sharing arrangement permanent. So I had to introduce, and was happy to do it, I introduced a second bill to do just that. That's why it took years to get this done. This week, I'm pleased to say the House passed my bill, the Ending Improper Payments to Deceased People Act. This bill had already passed the Senate, and now that it's passed the House, it's on its way to President Trump's desk so he can sign it into law. Now, dead people don't need welfare. I think that's obvious. But I'm not going to stop with just this bill. I'm going to continue to urge my colleagues in the Senate and my friends in the House to pass another reconciliation bill, which we can do without Democratic votes, just like we did the one big beautiful bill, to include the subject of welfare fraud. Welfare fraud. It's inexcusable, it's unconscionable. These are taxpayer dollars. And I'm not going to stop till we get it done.
At the core of Kennedy's argument is a fairly straightforward claim. The federal government has been sending large sums of money to people who are already dead. He cites a striking figure, about $1.3 billion in improper payments in 2023 alone, to emphasize the scale of the problem. According to him, these payments often occur because federal agencies are not properly sharing data with one another, particularly information about deceased Americans. Kennedy focuses heavily on the Social Security Administration's Death Master File, which is essentially a federal database of individuals who have died. States report deaths to the SSA. The SSA records them, but for years that information was not broadly shared across the federal government. So the result? Other agencies continued issuing checks because, from their perspective, there was no official record indicating the recipient was deceased. One important point to make here is that Kennedy frames this primarily as fraud, and in some cases, that framing is accurate. There are documented instances where relatives or associates knowingly cashed checks intended for someone who has already died. But from a neutral policy standpoint, this is also a systems failure, not just criminal behavior. In many cases, the government itself created the conditions for improper payments by failing to integrate its databases. When one agency knows someone has died and another agency doesn't, the error is almost inevitable. This distinction matters because it shapes how we think about solutions. Are we dealing with widespread criminal conspiracies or with outdated administrative structures that don't communicate effectively? Kennedy's bill addresses a second issue directly. One of the more revealing parts of Kennedy's remarks is his interaction with the Social Security Administration. When he asked why the Death Master File wasn't being shared, SSA's response was essentially, "We don't have legal authority to do that." And that's where the U.S. Constitution comes in. Under Article 1, Section 8, Congress controls federal spending and the rules governing it. Agencies cannot simply decide to share sensitive data across the government without statutory authorization, especially data involving personal identity, even in death. So from a constitutional standpoint, SSA was correct to say, this is Congress's job. Kennedy's first bill created a temporary authorization, allowing SSA to share the data with the Treasury Department, so it could be integrated into the do-not-pay system. That temporary nature was deliberate. It allowed Congress to test whether the policy worked without permanently altering federal data sharing rules. According to Kennedy, yes, he claims that since December 2023, the temporary data sharing arrangement has saved at least $330 million in improper payments. If accurate, that's a significant reduction in waste in a relatively short period of time. From an analytical perspective, that outcome strengthens the argument for making the policy permanent. When a pilot program demonstrably reduces improper spending without harming legitimate beneficiaries, Congress generally has a strong justification to codify it into law. This is also consistent with Congress's constitutional responsibility under the Appropriations Clause, which requires that taxpayer funds be spent as authorized and only as authorized. Paying deceased individuals clearly violates that principle. Kennedy's second bill, the one now headed to the president's desk, makes the data sharing arrangement permanent. This is a classic example of how the separation of powers is supposed to function. Congress identifies a problem, writes legislation, passes it through both chambers, and sends it to the executive branch for approval. The president then decides whether to sign it into law or veto it, regardless of where one stands politically. This process reflects constitutional governance working as intended. Toward the end of his remarks, Kennedy broadens the issue beyond this single bill. He argues that welfare fraud is widespread, morally wrong, and deserving of further legislative action, possibly through reconciliation, which would allow passage without bipartisan support. This is where analysis becomes especially important. Stopping payments to deceased individuals is a low controversy, high consensus reform ***. Expanding the conversation to welfare fraud more generally is far more complex and politically charged. There's a real risk that valid administrative reforms could be conflated with broader ideological debates about social safety nets. From a neutral standpoint, those issues should be addressed separately, with evidence tailored to each claim. So what does this all tell us? First, it highlights how government inefficiency, not just corruption, can lead to massive financial losses. Second, it shows the importance of Congress's constitutional role in authorizing data use and overseeing federal spending. Third, it demonstrates that targeted, narrowly defined reforms like improving data sharing can produce measurable results without cutting benefits or restructuring programs. And finally, it reminds us that while political rhetoric often simplifies problems into moral terms, effective governance usually depends on technical fixes, interagency coordination, and legislative clarity. In that sense, Kennedy's bill addresses a real and documented problem, but how this momentum is used going forward will matter just as much as the bill itself. That's my breakdown of Senator John Kennedy's remarks and the legislation he's promoting. If you found this analysis helpful and want more neutral, fact-based political breakdowns, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.